Hello, welcome to Simply Sacred, a loving gaze at the inner world in a modern society with your host, Auroara Leigh, and Erica Scott. And I am so happy that Erica was able to come on here today. I have gotten to know Erica in the last couple of years and her amazing book, Creating Consent Culture for Educators.
Hello, and yeah, thanks for having me. The book is titled Creating Consent Culture, a Handbook for Educators, but really parents have found it really useful as well. When we were first writing it, we were going to make it for humans age 10 to 110, but the publisher really wanted us to, have a niche. And we thought if we had to pick one niche, then educators of youth would be the best one to go for. But it's really the work in the book can be applied to adults. And adults really enjoy the exercises in the book as well.
Yeah, because this work brings up stuff for everyone. Really, at the end of the day, there's things that we've all experienced. I feel that we go, oh, was that consent culture? Was that in our own lives? And it brings stuff up, our own inner narratives. What did family, what did society say? What did we learn? I love that you say that because if you're listening, this book will likely enlighten you in some way. Let's dive in. What is consent culture?
Okay, in the book, we define it as a culture that is conducive to people having mutually agreeable interactions, free of power dynamics, where everyone's, agency and dignity is supported. Everyone's able to ask for what they want and say yes or no. And as you were saying, we've all had experiences. We've all been taught the wrong thing. And unfortunately, it's still ongoing. The messaging, the youth today are having all kinds of messaging thrown at them that is conflicting. And they might learn about consent in school or from their peers, but then they see porn or they see movies. And a lot of times in movies, there's behavior that's would be considered criminal stalking in real life, but it's shown as romantic in movies.
Yeah, it's glamorized to someone says no, but if I can persuade them and then they eventually give in and say yes, then I'm some sort of charming victor, right? Like it's glamorized.
And just weird messaging. There's this trope that's been going on for decades now that if you really love someone, you're going to hate each other when you first meet. But then somehow you'll magically fall in love at some point. And that has confused people now for generations. It's not usually how it works.
Mhm.
Um, and of course, porn has gotten more and more aggressive and coercive, like the mainstream porn that's free. That's what most kids would be exposed to. And that's very aggressive and coercive now. And of course, almost entirely from the male gaze and a lot of confusing messages for young people. And there's still the messaging that boys are supposed to ask and girls are be the gatekeepers. And what we really, in the book, what we're aiming for is not a permissive model of consent where one person asks and the other person says yes or no, but a collaborative one where it's like, how are we going to play together? Okay, what does everybody want? What does everybody need to feel safe? And everyone has the opportunity to say yes or no. There's a lot of myths that we're fighting when we do that are still ingrained, even if they're unspoken. In my last cohort, I was teaching a woman who is a grade 5 teacher, and she asked her class, can the girls ask the boys out? And the boys were like, yeah, sure, that would be great. And the girls were like, no way, we would never do that. That would be weird. We'd be the only ones. They'd think we're thirsty. They'll think we're bad. We can't do that. And so that messaging is still coming
Yeah.
out there.
Oh, yeah.
You can't even ask someone out, let alone ask for what they want. It's such an outdated paradigm of how male and female should interact. And we really need to bust out of it. It's rests on all these myths, and it's hard on guys as well. So there's this whole pressure on guys. They're supposed to always know what to do. They're supposed to take charge. They're supposed to be lead. And then even if they don't know anything, and then if the girl knows more than them, somehow that's bad. It's still like that. So there's so much for us to unlearn as older people. And then from there, we can help younger people like see through. And Even if we learn together, that's great. Let's question all this and where's that coming from and why would it be like that? In reality, for us to have good interactions, everyone needs to be able to ask for what they want. Everyone needs to be able to say yes or no.
And it comes down to what is respect again, too, right? Because if a person is respected, they're going to be heard when they say no the first time, right? Or they say, this is what I need. And it's not, oh, I'm going to now trump that because I have an agenda. I'm going to bypass that. I don't even see that. I don't even pick up on it. I don't even in their nervous system, they're not picking up on the cues, right? Because there's an agenda, there's a mindset, there's an intention, and is what do I need to do to get to that goal? Rather than what you're saying, where it's this continual communication and relationship and mindfulness and back and forth. And then how would we do it this way? And it's okay to say no at any part of it as well. You can say yes, and then you can say no. But there's just been such a programming, hey? And that programming, from what I've seen, the children have been very aware of that there's something off kilter, and they're wanting adults to be more informed and capable of these challenging conversations, but that's not necessarily always the case, right? And it's like when you go back to women's teachings again around being connected to yourself, and why would we see the period menstruation cycle as something yucky that you have to have perfumed pads for and things like that? That's part of that social indoctrination and internalized shame. And
Exactly.
how are girls getting new messages if the mums and the grandmothers had traumatic experiences and they've shut that down? They've clamped down into a freeze response. And freeze responses are huge, hey?
Absolutely. Yeah. So to me, hearing no is actually the most essential consent skill because you have to be able to hear no even when no's not being said. We say to kids, only an enthusiastic yes is a yes, but then we don't show them what that looks like or what that means. And I go into classrooms and I'll say, is this consent? And then I'll say, okay, sure. And there will be kids in the class and not just the neurodivergent kids that say, yeah, because you said yes. So you really need to be teaching kids how to not just hear no, but to also recognize no when it's not being said. And sometimes that means silence and passivity, which is what happens when someone has a freeze response. So how I usually start every workshop is actually just getting kids to practice saying no and hearing it. And right away, there'll be nervousness, laughter, and we'll talk about why is it hard to say no? Because for most people, it's hard to say no, even in a low stakes situation. And that's normal. We don't want to hurt people's feelings. We don't want to, we want people to like us. We don't want to cause conflict. Maybe we've said no before and it didn't work, so we don't feel comfortable with it now. As a parent, you can have this discussion with your kids about, is it ever hard for you to say no? Why is it hard? Why do you think it's hard for other people to say no? And really dive into it. And once people understand how it can be so hard and even impossible to say no sometimes, as in the case of the freeze response, which I'll talk about in a minute, then they understand the need to really work at recognizing no and hearing no graciously. And what we do is we actually teach people to thank people when they say no. And at first that feels weird because we don't do that usually. You don't usually thank people when they tell you no, but it actually doesn't take that long to get used to it. And I've seen kids get used to it in a matter of a couple hours. And then I hear from teachers and that weeks later, they catch them thanking each other when they say no. And it totally shifts the paradigm because once you've been thanked for saying no, there's this new level of safety. There's this new level of feeling like, oh, like it's okay to really express what my true boundaries are. And I'll give you all that homework. Anyone who's listening, try to find an opportunity to thank someone for saying no to you about a personal boundary. Obviously, if your kids say, no, I don't want to do the dishes, that's not the time. But if they're saying, no, I don't want to do that anymore, I've outgrown that, or whatever it is, that's the time to say, hey, thanks for recognizing what your boundary is and letting me know, because I want to know what your boundaries are. Now you're modeling how you want other people to recognize their boundaries as well.
So we talked about the book, what consent culture is. Now you're sharing how you actually work with kids, right? So you're doing that in the classroom setting. Are you doing that across BC? Can you explain that a bit more for the listener?
Yeah, I go into classrooms and I teach a workshop that teaches basic consent skills like what do I do when I'm a maybe? How to hear no graciously, how to check in with yourself to recognize if you're a yes or a no, how to ask for what you want clearly, how to avoid miscommunications. To me, these are all really essential consent skills and more than that as well. But I also really love to teach teachers. I do Pro D Day presentations and I do train the trainers. And I can do that for parents as well. I can also do that for businesses, for their HR people, or for their employees to create a better work environment. These skills are really important for all of us. And I didn't say in the beginning, but the reason I teach these skills is because I'm a survivor of child sexual abuse and I had real problems with my boundaries for so long. And when I learned these skills, it changed everything for me. And I'm still learning, I'm still practicing. That's another thing about consent skills. You don't just learn them and then you're good. They need to be practiced. So this is also why I love teaching teachers, because then they can integrate the exercises into their year-long studies. And hopefully, if kids practice these skills over and year after year, ideally, then they'll really get them down. Because it's when you feel it on an embodied level that, oh, I can say no and it will be heard. And then also, if you're in a situation and your no's not being heard, you're going to recognize it more quickly because you're used to having it honored. And also, oh, I can get better at hearing no. We could all get better at hearing no. We could all get better at checking in with ourselves to figure out what do we want? What do we not want? This is another thing I really love to talk with people about too, is teach our kids that it's normal and common to be unsure. It happens all the time. It happens to all of us. And that there's a way to figure out what you want and what you don't want, and that you can check in with yourself to notice how you're feeling and how that might be changing as things progress or things change. And that it's totally normal for things to change, and it's normal for your feelings to change, and it's okay to change your mind.
You're really
Uh,
talking about creating safe spaces too in general. So this aligns with so much of the work that needs to go into all school systems and all spaces, in my opinion. I know that very recently it was announced that it's going to become more mandatory to have trauma-informed spaces, and consent culture really parallels with trauma-informed spaces. And I'm not sure for your experience with your childhood sexual abuse and how you overcame through learning consent culture teachings and understandings, but if part of that was that you unfroze as you allowed yourself to say no, and that there was this softening over time for you to be able to heal and be present and connected and nurture that part of you and connections with other people again, because it really does tie to that freeze response. So I'm curious if you can unpack what the freeze response is.
yeah, I'd love to. Yeah. So a lot of times young people tell me that learning about the freeze response is one of the most impactful parts of the workshop for them. So when I was growing up, all we ever heard about was fight or flight. And those are autonomic responses that happen when your body is feeling like your life is in danger and you're having a trauma response. But it's not just fight or flight. It's actually fight, flight, freeze, and fawn.
Mhm.
That freeze is actually the most common response to sexual assault by far. And it's the most common response in children who suffer abuse or trauma. And once we've had a freeze response, it's like it creates a neural pathway and we're more likely to have a freeze response again. Why it's so important to me to share this information is because a lot of people still don't understand the freeze response. And then they don't understand why they didn't say no, or why they didn't run away, or why they didn't fight back. And then they blame themselves.
In
And
them.
other people blame them too.
That's why I made the song Release, because it's me singing It's Not Your Fault, but with binaural tones to help to release that. There's a blame narrative, an internal shame narrative for many who have experienced abuse and therefore freezes.
Yeah.
I remember just having people put their arm around me and I would freeze. So I'm
Mm.
not able to say no. I'm in a freeze now. And that freeze response comes from the polyvagal theory, right? That we have that dorsal vagal nervous system that's evolved from fish. That when they would see something in the water, they would freeze. And so when our system thinks something might be bad for us, to that level, we freeze. And it's more of an activation than being able to run and being able to fight, because it's the impending doom that the nervous system senses or thinks it might be, is to the degree where you can only freeze in order to survive and cope, hopefully. So for people to be living in that because of other humans around them, because those people aren't honoring boundaries, then that's something that we can help to shift as a society. And I know in Australia, they made it mandatory for all schools to have consent culture in the education, hey?
Yeah, I thought that they legislated it, but what they have done is they have mandated consent to education in the schools, but it hasn't been legislated yet. And now in BC, actually, consent has been added to the curriculum as well, to the health curriculum. But that's another thing where not all consent education is equal. And unfortunately, a lot of consent education out there is still based on this old permissive model. And then there's a lot of emphasis on saying no, being firmer, being more clear when you say no. And there's not a recognition of why it's hard for people to say no. There's not a compassion for people being unable to say no. Like you were saying, when I was younger, I couldn't say no because of my experience of abuse when I was young. I just didn't feel like I had a right to say no. And that might be hard for people to understand, but that's what happens when you're just trained that your body's not under your control, it's under someone else's control. And that takes a lot to overcome. And that's why people need to really pay attention, because you could find yourself in a situation where you're contributing to someone's abuse without meaning to, because they just don't have boundaries. And that's scary for everyone when someone doesn't have boundaries.
And it's not a small statistic, like people like in your situation where you didn't know how to say no because of what you went through. It's actually a huge statistic of people who have been sexually assaulted in some way, and other forms of violence as well. Physical violence has that psychological effect as well, right? And same with verbal, mental abuse and emotional abuse. We know that the pain receptors respond in such a way that it's a physical pain. There's no differentiation in our brain. It picks it up as though it's the same pain as if someone was, say, cutting you or something, right? And so verbal and emotional abuse as well over time can cause that inability to say no. So a lot of people are walking with this reality. And so I think that it's important that shift in that paradigm comes through.
Absolutely. And the thing is, most people don't want to hurt each other. There is a small percentage of people that are predatory for whatever reason. Maybe they have something wrong with their brain chemistry or whatever it is. There's like probably less than 5% of the population that actually wants to hurt other people. They can see the walking wounded among us who can't say no, and they prey on that. But most of us don't want to hurt each other. And that's where this education comes in, because we can avoid the miscommunication. There's this great book called Sexual Citizens, and it's based on studies in colleges in the US. And they interviewed a bunch of survivors of sexual assault. They said, I don't know why I didn't say no. I don't know why I didn't say no. I should have said no. I knew I could say no, but I didn't say no. And sometimes they might have been having a freeze response, and sometimes they were just in very complex situations with people that they were more concerned about not hurting their feelings than they were about their own well-being. And that comes from these messed up messages that we get about our self-worth. Because in a bunch of those situations, the people who perpetrated the harm, they didn't mean to perpetrate harm, but they didn't pay enough attention to make sure it was enthusiastic consent. And that's where we say that, but we need to really make that the standard. It's not about being respectful when someone says no. It's about recognizing a lack of enthusiastic consent.
And then if someone is the victim, whatever gender it is, if someone has been harmed in some way, and how they're received really matters, or else they may not come forward in truth again after. So I've seen it where if the kind of social pollution and messaging back when someone is a victim and they speak up and they say, hey, this happened last night, or whenever it was when they unfroze enough to decide to share, and then they're met with victim blaming or shaming, or you're probably just making that up, or look at you're causing drama. There's so many negative reinforcement messages that can come after, and I've
Yeah.
seen it happen. And then how likely is that person to want to come forward again?
Even if they don't understand themselves why they didn't say no, how are they going to go report that? You know what I mean? So that's why it's so important for people to understand about the freeze response and understand why they don't say no, why they can't leave, why they can't fight back. A freeze response makes you freeze and you're not able to do these things. You might be able to say a few words, but you're not going to be able to say what you really want to say. And this is the thing, like a fight, flight, freeze response, these are autonomic responses. They happen in less than 15 milliseconds. That's faster than you can have a thought. It happens in the brain stem. Your brain adjusts, your circulate, like you can't control it. And that's something I've had parents say to me, we just need to teach them not to have a freeze response. It doesn't work like that. It's out of your conscious control. And that's something I really try to get through to people. This is not in your conscious control. Your brain stem decides which autonomic response you're going to have in a traumatic situation. And that's what happens. You couldn't have done anything differently. Yeah, it's so important for people to understand that. And nobody wants that. Nobody, but it's out of your control. But it's such a relief to know what happened, because I know for myself, I've always had freeze responses and I used to beat myself up about it and think, I guess I'm just not as courageous as I thought I was. I guess I'm a wimp. And when I learned about the freeze response, I was like, now I get it. Now I understand what's happening. Because me too, I was always like, I have a plan. The next time someone tries something, they're going to get it. And then I would freeze.
Women have shared before that they didn't see it as rape because they think in their head that they should have fought someone off.
And this is actually, in some places, that's still the law. Like in Japan, if you don't fight back, then the law won't consider it rape. And it used to be like that in a lot of places in North America. I don't think it is in most states anymore. And it's not in Canada. Enthusiastic consent is the standard. But we still have this idea, there's this myth that rape is something that happens when it's loud and people are screaming no and there's physical aggression. The reality is it's usually very quiet and not a lot of movement because the victim is having a freeze response. So that's one of the myths that we really have to combat. And also too, there's also this idea that you can't change your mind at a certain point. And so I've had women tell me, I guess I went to his place, so I guess it's not rape. Or he's my boyfriend, so it couldn't be rape. No, we're always allowed, when it comes to our bodily autonomy, we are always allowed to change our mind at any time, no matter what, even if you're married to the person for 50 years.
I know
But
that.
that used to be the law. And that's still the law in places as well. In India, you still can't legally rape your spouse. And we're still talking a little bit about the freeze response. I just want to say something I talk more about now. I didn't mention it in the book, but it's become apparent to me. It's one of the reasons that victims feel ashamed and don't report is unwanted arousal. And that happens in all genders. Most or many people have unwanted arousal during sexual assault. And then that makes them feel confused, ashamed, especially I think for males, and then it makes them less likely to report as well.
Yeah. But I think of it as if someone was forcing a food in your mouth, your taste buds are still going to activate and you're still going to taste it, even though you don't want to eat the food. If you're being force fed, like you're still going to have the sensations of whether it was sweet or bitter or sour or whatever the reality.
Another automatic response of the body. There's a scientific term for it, arousal non-concordance.
Mm.
So it can go both ways. You can sometimes want to be aroused and you can't feel it. It's not happening. And then sometimes you don't want to be aroused and it happens. And they call it arousal non-concordance. But it's very common in sexual assault for the body to automatically react with an arousal response. And that doesn't mean it was your fault. It doesn't mean you enjoyed it. And it doesn't mean that you wanted it. So that's another thing that's important to talk to people about.
So I'd love to talk a bit about some action steps that people can take away to feel really good about, okay, I taught the young boys or young girls that I'm around, they can do these action steps or that kind of thing. So what would you suggest for the listeners?
So one thing I'd really like adults to do is model thanking people when they say no about their boundaries. You can do this with kids in class, but you can do it with your own kids. It's normal for our boundaries to change at any time, but especially as we're growing. And if your child says, hey, don't pull on my ponytail anymore, or don't pat me on the bum anymore, then be like, hey, thanks for letting me know. You're getting older and you used to think that was fun, but now you don't. So I'm glad you figured that out and I'm glad you told me. And now I know what your new boundary is. And I'm glad I do because I don't want to cross your boundaries. I want you to feel safe and I want you to know you can always tell me what your boundaries are. I was telling this to one mom and she was like, oh, I wish I'd known that. Because in her case, it was patting her daughter on the bum. And her daughter said, Mom, I'm too old for that. And she was like, oh, you're all grown up, and made fun of her. And she's
Mhm.
like, oh, I feel bad now. If I wish I had known then what I know now. And don't we all? I wish I had known so many more things when my kids were younger. I think if you want to take action steps, that's one of the main things you can do is model thanking someone when they say no and express their boundaries. And also you can practice with them, learning for them to hear and recognize no as well. If they're young enough, they might think it's fun to role model that you're someone they want to ask out or something. And then they can learn how to be really cool about hearing no, which that's another thing is when you thank someone for saying no, it's not awkward anymore. It's way worse to hear no and then just have an awkward silence or run away embarrassed. It actually can build the relationship if the person realizes, oh, I can say no to this person and it's safe to do, and it feels actually okay and we can move on from it. Now I feel safer around them and it actually builds intimacy. So it's something you can practice with them. I think one of the most basic skills that people can help their young people with is modeling and practicing checking in with yourself. Taking the time, don't just automatically default to yes or no. Take the time to really think and go, I have to think about that. Let me check in with myself. How do I feel about this option? How do I feel about that option? So then you're modeling a few things. You're modeling that it's okay to be unsure. It's okay to take time to think about it. It's okay to check in with yourself. And then you could practice with them. Like, how do we check in with ourselves? How do we notice if we're a yes or no? How do we notice if our yes is changing to a no gradually? How do we keep checking in with ourselves? So yeah, that's another really important skill that, again, we could all get better at because we've grown up in a culture that's, it doesn't matter how you feel, just keep going, do the thing you have to do, shove it down, shove your feelings down, shove your feelings down, just keep functioning, right? It's quite the reversal to be like, I'm not sure and I'm going to take the time to figure it out and I'm going to really just explore how I feel about that. And then I'm going to honor those feelings.
What are some action steps that youth can know to take away to what they can do other than the ones you've already said?
So for parents and for educators, a lot of times we're waiting for kids to ask us the questions. And when it comes to sex and relationships, the kids are waiting for us to say something.
Mhm.
And so the conversation just isn't being had. That is happening a lot. So just be brave and start that conversation. Don't wait for your kids to ask you, especially now they are like the average age a kid sees porn online is 11 or something now. You need to have conversations early to make sure that they feel comfortable to come talk to you, that they understand that things they see online are not reality. And one of the ways you can do that is when you see things together on TV, you can have a conversation like, does that seem realistic to you? Or why do you think he did that? Or why do you think she did that? And what would you do? And stuff like that. But Some of these conversations are uncomfortable to start, or they could feel that way, but it's so important. It's important because it lets your kid know that's something they can talk to you about. And then if they have questions, maybe they are going to be able to ask you once you start the conversation, right?
I teach my daughter to watch actions and not just words, because words can be mystifying, or those with agendas or intentions will use lots of words, but it's the actions that you listen to and watch. And because that also permeates any risk of self-doubt. Did that happen? Or was that, no, that they cornered you in a hallway at a party, right? And they wanted you to go into your body space parameters, right? You can't be gaslit for that. That happened. Or watch the actions of a boy that wants, does he want to take you out to the movies and do activities out of the house? Or is he just wanting to come into your personal space? What are the actions, not just the words? And so that's the biggest takeaway, I hope, for my daughter, as well as being vocal, because people don't go for the person who's vocal. They don't think that they can prey on them. Like you said before, it's the meek ones that are often preyed upon by those rarer predator types, but they are out there. And being a vocal person also helps to keep your friend group safe too, because if they know that that meek person's friend is vocal, then they're less likely also to encroach and do something they hope that they can get away with. So being vocal is also a huge immunity blanket.
Yeah. And that is one of the things, a few of the exercises in the book help to practice in a fun way, just saying and hearing no and saying and hearing yes and having fun with it. And it's just great to have that practice. I do just want to emphasize, yes, of course, we want to teach our kids to say no, but we also want to make sure they understand why they might have a hard time saying no, why it might be impossible to say no, and that it's okay if they didn't say no, that what matters is a lack of enthusiasm. If they aren't enthusiastic about something, then that's not okay for someone to try to do something with them.
That's a good self-awareness tool, even for ourselves, right? Do I really want to do this? And knowing yourself, like you said, getting used to dropping into yourself more. It's a
Mhm.
good self-awareness tool as well. Am I enthusiastic? Like, I knew I was enthusiastic about doing this podcast with you today, right? And it's a really good tracker to get to know yourself more, of what it is you truly want or what you think you should do, right? Because I should on myself in the past, I have especially should on myself a lot more. I should probably do that, right? And that can be really correlated too with, oh, maybe I should, but do I really want to, right? What do I truly want? Who am I?
Am I saying yes to this because I really want to, or am I saying yes because it'll please that person, or I think they'll like me more if I say yes, or whatever it is, right? Or I'm afraid of the reaction if I don't say yes, or whatever it is. Yeah, for sure.
So for anyone, there could be people have stuffs come up for them listening to this and this reflection. I think we could talk a little bit about healing from outcomes of crossing of boundaries. I think that a lot of people have had experiences where boundaries have been crossed, and that can make it sometimes challenging to enter this work because it brings that stuff up. But it's really important not to avoid, right? It's important to do that healing, or even if you don't plan to do this work, but there's stuff coming up, how can some people heal those lines once they've been crossed? Because they can be very damaging to people. It can prevent people from going out and doing what they normally love to do. And slowly over time, that really takes a toll on people's lives.
Absolutely. And many of us have crossed other people's boundaries because we learned the wrong thing and we didn't know the right thing to do. And there's a lot of guilt and shame around that as well. And people want to avoid the work because they don't want to look at that as well. This brings up stuff for everyone. I really try to teach it in a trauma-informed way. We really need to approach all this with a lot of compassion for ourselves and others. We all learn the wrong thing growing up. We're still learning the wrong thing in a lot of ways. And so there's a lot to unlearn as well as learn. And yeah, there just really needs to be a lot of compassion and care for people being triggered, for people going into shame spirals. And so I try to teach it in a trauma-informed way and make sure, like when I'm in classrooms, I make sure there's a guidance counselor available, at least one. I make sure that they know they can leave the room if they need to or want to and go to the guidance counselor or go to the washroom, or even they can sit back, and none of the exercises are require anyone to touch anyone, but it still could be triggering for people. So I make sure they know that they can participate by observing rather than participating. But I also tell them, but you'll get more out of it if you participate, because most of the exercises are actually fun. And that's the thing. We've talked about a lot of heavy things today, but when we do these exercises, kids have fun and they laugh. It's a fun, interactive way to practice these skills. And like one thing I've said is fighting rape culture is hard, but creating consent culture is actually fun. Um,
And I've taken Erica's facilitation training and I do recommend it. It is a lot of fun. There's a lot of self-inquiry and then exploration. And I think it's really great. I think it's great what you're doing as well across the board. So do you go across BC or anywhere that kind of calls you in?
yeah, if I'm supported to travel, I'll go anywhere. Absolutely.
Good. I find art too really good for healing. So if people have stuff coming up from this episode or anything like poetry, art, like painting, drawing, writing, everything, anything expressive to move it, or dance. Dance can also move it out of the body as well, or going for a walk or something. That clarity, because these conversations matter and it can bring it up to the surface, but trusting that it comes out and through as well.
Absolutely. And we were talking about it one time, we were talking about taking it to the water and giving your pain to the water. And you said something really amazing. I thought that even you can just take a shower and let the water take it away. I think that can be really powerful as well.
So where can people find you?
My website is creatingconsentculture.com, and you can find my courses and the book on there. And I have actually course consent lesson plans available now. And yeah, I'm teaching another facilitation course like the one that Aurora took in the fall, and I have an early bird discount on right now. And yeah, I'd love to have you join me.
Okay, thank you so much for taking the time to have a chat and bring wellness to all over with this podcast. So I really appreciate you. I appreciate the work that you're doing. I appreciate how you model to me like this beautiful, graceful, humble facilitator. You were such a consent-based facilitator, even as you're teaching. You're so consent oriented to the learner. And it was really remarkable for me to see how you facilitate. And so I just really honor and appreciate the time together that we've had today.
Thank you so much, Aurora. I really appreciate you too. This has been really wonderful.
Yay. So thanks for tuning in to Simply Sacred, a loving gaze at the inner world in a modern society.